What I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you understand global security and the hidden meetings that determine our planet's future. While the world focused on economic summits and trade negotiations, something unprecedented was happening behind closed doors. The largest military gathering in recorded history was taking place, and the reason will shock you to your core. On November 15th, 2024, representatives from every major military power on Earth received the same encrypted message. Within 72 hours, generals, admirals, defense ministers, and intelligence chiefs from 47 nations were boarding flights to an undisclosed location. No media coverage, no public announcements, complete operational silence. But here's what they don't want you to know. This wasn't about terrorism, nuclear threats, or regional conflicts. This was about something that had been tracked in the deepest levels of classified surveillance networks for months. Something that was forcing sworn enemies to work together for the first time in modern history. The object, designated 3I Atlas, had triggered the most significant military response since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what happened in those classified briefings would redefine everything we thought we knew about planetary defense and humanity's place in the universe. Before we dive into this rabbit hole together, make sure you hit that subscribe button because this story goes deeper than anyone imagined. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you think really happened during those 96 hours of complete communication blackout. The story begins 3 months earlier when deep space monitoring stations started picking up anomalies that didn't match any known classification system. Dr. Sarah Chen, a radar specialist at NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain facility, was conducting routine asteroid tracking when her instruments detected something that made her question her own equipment calibration. The object was massive, traveling at impossible speeds and following a trajectory that suggested intentional navigation rather than random cosmic drift. But what truly alarmed military analysts wasn't the object's size or speed. It was the mathematical precision of its approach vector. When Chen ran the probability calculations, the results were staggering. The likelihood of any natural object following such a precise path through our solar system was approximately 1 in 847 million. Those aren't coincidence numbers, those are design numbers. Within hours, the detection had been classified at the highest levels of national security. But here's where things get interesting. Similar readings were being recorded simultaneously by monitoring stations in Russia, China, the European Union, and 12 other nations. The object was too large and too obvious to hide. For the first time since the Cold War, traditional adversaries found themselves sharing the same impossible data. Enemy intelligence agencies were reaching the same terrifying conclusion independently. This wasn't a weapon from any earthly nation. This was something else entirely. The Pentagon's initial response followed standard protocols for unknown aerial phenomena, increased surveillance, analyzed trajectory patterns, prepare defensive countermeasures. But as more data poured in, standard protocols became completely inadequate. 3. I-Atlas wasn't just passing through our solar system, it was conducting what could only be described as systematic reconnaissance. The object's path would bring it within optimal scanning distance of Earth, Mars, and Jupiter, The timing suggested coordination. The precision suggested intelligence. General Patricia Morrison, head of U.S. Space Command, found herself briefing the Joint Chiefs on scenarios that no military academy had ever prepared officers to consider. We're looking at technological capabilities that exceed our understanding by orders of magnitude, she reported in classified documents that would later leak through congressional oversight committees. The object demonstrates propulsion systems that appear to violate known physics, navigation accuracy that surpasses our most advanced guidance systems, and operational patterns that suggest strategic reconnaissance rather than random exploration. But Morrison's assessment was just the beginning. As intelligence agencies worldwide began sharing their independent analyses, a disturbing picture emerged. Every major military power had reached the same conclusion through different detection methods and analytical frameworks. China's Ministry of State Security had been tracking unusual electromagnetic signatures that correlated perfectly with the object's position. Russia's GRU had detected gravitational anomalies that matched the trajectory timeline. Britain's GCHQ had intercepted structured radio emissions that appeared to be scanning protocols. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and absolutely terrifying. Humanity was being surveilled by technology that made our most advanced military systems look like Stone Age tools. The decision to convene the largest military meeting in history wasn't made by any single nation or alliance. It emerged from a series of back-channel communications between intelligence agencies who realized that traditional concepts of national security had become obsolete overnight. When facing potential threats that transcend earthly boundaries, territorial disputes and ideological differences suddenly seem remarkably petty. The survival of human civilization creates very different priorities than protecting national interests. The meeting location was chosen specifically for its symbolic significance. A neutral facility in Switzerland, historically used for international peace negotiations, was quietly converted into the most secure military conference center ever constructed. Electronic shielding, signal dampening, and counter-surveillance measures that cost more than most nations' entire defense budgets. But getting the world's military leaders to attend required unprecedented diplomatic coordination. Sworn enemies who hadn't spoken in decades were suddenly participating in joint planning sessions. Nuclear adversaries were sharing their most classified detection capabilities. The logistics alone were staggering. Coordinating the schedules of 47 defense establishments while maintaining operational security required months of preparation. Every participant understood that public knowledge of the meeting would trigger global panic, economic collapse, and social chaos, so they implemented what intelligence professionals call a cover story within a cover story. Officially, the gathering was described as a routine NATO expansion planning session. Unofficially, it was leaked as a climate security summit addressing environmental warfare. Both explanations were designed to sound boring enough that media attention would be minimal. The real agenda remained known only to a handful of individuals with the highest security clearances. And what they discussed during those 96 hours would challenge every assumption about human preparedness for cosmic-scale threats. Admiral James Richardson, former head of naval intelligence, would later describe the atmosphere as unlike anything in his 30-year career. You have to understand, these are people trained to plan for every conceivable scenario, he explained in testimony that was immediately classified. Nuclear war, biological weapons, cyber attacks, terrorist operations. We have protocols for everything, but this was different. We were discussing response strategies for technology that might be centuries or millennia beyond our capabilities. How do you defend against threats that can manipulate physics in ways we don't understand? The first 24 hours focused on intelligence sharing and threat assessment. Every nation presented their independent analysis of 3I Atlas, and the consistency of the findings eliminated any remaining doubt about the object's artificial nature. The electromagnetic signatures detected by Chinese monitoring stations matched perfectly with the gravitational anomalies recorded by Russian deep space radar. European telescopic observations confirmed the precise navigation patterns identified by American satellite tracking systems. But perhaps most disturbing were the behavioral analyses conducted by psychological warfare specialists from multiple nations. The object's reconnaissance patterns suggested intelligence gathering that was systematic, comprehensive, and appeared designed to assess human technological capabilities and defensive responses. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a strategic analyst with NATO's Emerging Threats Division, presented findings that sent cold chills through the assembled military leadership. The object's scanning priorities correlate strongly with our most critical infrastructure installations, she reported. Power generation facilities, communication networks, transportation hubs, military installations. This suggests intelligence gathering focused on identifying vulnerabilities rather than simple scientific curiosity. We may be observing threat assessment rather than peaceful exploration. The implications were staggering. If 3I Atlas represented advanced reconnaissance for a larger force, humanity might have months or weeks to prepare for contact scenarios that could range from peaceful diplomacy to existential warfare. But preparation required capabilities that didn't exist. Earth's combined military forces possessed nothing that could intercept an object traveling at interplanetary velocities while demonstrating propulsion technology that appeared to ignore fundamental physical laws. Traditional weapon systems became irrelevant when confronting technology that could manipulate gravity, electromagnetic fields, and potentially other forces that human science had barely begun to understand. Nuclear deterrence meant nothing against intelligence that might view human civilization as we view ant colonies. The second day of meetings focused on response scenarios and contingency planning. Military strategists from around the world attempted to develop frameworks for managing contact with technology that exceeded human capabilities by unknown margins. The discussions revealed fundamental limitations in human strategic thinking when confronting truly alien capabilities. Every military doctrine, every defense protocol, every tactical manual assumed confrontation between forces operating according to similar technological principles. But 3I Atlas represented something entirely different, a potential adversary with capabilities so advanced that conventional military responses might be not just ineffective, but completely irrelevant. General Morrison would later describe the planning sessions as the most humbling experience of her military career. We're trained to find solutions, to develop strategies, to overcome obstacles through superior planning and execution, she explained. But how do you plan for contact with intelligence that might be to us what we are to insects? The honest answer was that they couldn't. Not with existing capabilities, not with current understanding, not with human technology that suddenly seemed primitive beyond imagination. The third day brought the most controversial discussions in military history. Intelligence agencies began presenting evidence that 3I Atlas wasn't operating alone. Deep space monitoring networks had detected what appeared to be coordinated signals between the primary object and at least 3 smaller signatures positioned throughout the outer solar system. Colonel Marcus Webb from the Defense Intelligence Agency delivered a briefing that would haunt every person in that room for the rest of their careers. Pattern analysis suggests we're observing a networked reconnaissance operation, he explained, while displaying classified tracking data on screens that had never shown anything remotely similar. The smaller objects appear to be maintaining station-keeping positions that provide overlapping surveillance coverage of Earth's orbital space. This isn't random exploration. This is systematic intelligence gathering using distributed sensor platforms. The revelation that humanity might be surrounded by surveillance technology triggered immediate debates about disclosure versus containment. Several European defense ministers argued for limited public warnings to begin civilian preparations. Others, particularly from nations with large populations, insisted that any public acknowledgement would cause social collapse before defensive measures could be implemented. Russian General Viktor Petrov, a man who had survived the final years of the Soviet Union and understood societal fragility, presented the mathematical models that ended the disclosure debate. Economic disruption from public panic would reduce our industrial capacity by approximately 60% within 30 days, he calculated with brutal precision. Food distribution networks would collapse within 2 weeks. Critical infrastructure maintenance would become impossible as personnel abandoned their posts. We would effectively destroy our civilization through panic before any external threat materialized. The room fell silent as military leaders from every major nation absorbed the implications. They were trapped in an impossible situation. Preparing for potential contact required massive resource mobilization and international coordination. But public knowledge of the threat would likely cause the collapse of the very systems needed for defense. The solution they developed would become known in classified circles as Operation Silent Shield, a coordinated deception campaign designed to mobilize military and scientific resources under cover stories that wouldn't trigger public panic. Space agencies worldwide would suddenly receive massive budget increases for asteroid defense programs. Deep space monitoring networks would be quietly expanded under environmental satellite initiatives. Military research facilities would begin receiving funding for atmospheric studies and climate monitoring systems. The cover stories were brilliant in their mundane plausibility. Politicians could announce increased spending on asteroid threats and climate monitoring without raising questions about the urgency or scope of the programs. Media coverage would focus on routine government spending rather than existential preparations. But beneath the bureaucratic camouflage, the largest military mobilization in human history was beginning. Research facilities that had operated on modest budgets for decades suddenly found themselves with unlimited resources and classified mandates. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, whose career had focused on routine space telescope operations, discovered that her small observatory team had been designated as a critical national security asset overnight. We went from tracking asteroids as a scientific curiosity to being told we were humanity's early warning system, she would later recall in congressional testimony that remained sealed for decades. The funding appeared so fast it was almost surreal. Equipment that we'd been requesting for years through normal channels suddenly arrived within weeks. Personnel who had worked on civilian projects their entire careers were being read into classification levels they never knew existed. The technological challenges were staggering beyond comprehension. Military engineers found themselves tasked with developing defensive systems against capabilities they couldn't understand using principles they couldn't access. How do you design countermeasures against propulsion technology that appears to manipulate gravitational fields? How do you jam communication systems that might operate through quantum entanglement or dimensional mechanics that human physics hadn't discovered? The answer was that you couldn't, not directly, but you could prepare for scenarios based on educated guesses about potential vulnerabilities in even the most advanced technology. Dr. Sarah Kim from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory was assigned to lead what became known as the Asymmetric Response Project. Her mandate was simple in concept, but impossible in execution. Find weaknesses in technology that might be centuries beyond human understanding. Kim's approach was brilliantly unconventional. Instead of trying to match alien capabilities, she focused on exploiting potential assumptions that advanced intelligence might make about primitive civilizations. Advanced technology often becomes dependent on complex systems integration. She theorized and classified reports that read more like science fiction than military planning. Sophisticated intelligence might overlook simple disruption methods because they're too primitive to be considered threatening. Her team began developing what they called caveman protocols, electromagnetic pulse devices designed not to destroy advanced technology, but to create enough interference to disrupt complex sensor networks. Kinetic impact systems that relied on brute force rather than sophisticated guidance. The theory was that intelligence capable of manipulating fundamental forces might be vulnerable to attacks so primitive they wouldn't anticipate them, like a computer virus designer who forgets to protect against someone simply unplugging the machine. Other research teams took different approaches. Biological warfare specialists began studying potential vulnerabilities that any carbon-based life forms might share. Psychological operations experts developed communication protocols for first contact scenarios, ranging from peaceful diplomacy to hostage negotiation. But the most disturbing research focused on scorched earth contingencies. If diplomatic contact failed and military resistance proved impossible, how could humanity ensure that Earth provided no useful resources or information to potentially hostile intelligence? The plans developed during those classified sessions remain among the most closely guarded secrets in human history. Protocols for disabling global communication networks to prevent intelligence gathering. Procedures for destroying critical infrastructure to deny resources. Methods for eliminating technological databases to prevent reverse engineering of human capabilities. General Morrison later described these discussions as the darkest moments of her career. We were planning for the potential necessity of destroying our own civilization to prevent it from being exploited by hostile intelligence, she admitted in sealed testimony. The psychological impact on everyone involved was devastating. These were people who had dedicated their lives to protecting human society, suddenly forced to plan for its systematic destruction as a defensive measure. The fourth and final day of meetings focused on coordination protocols and long-term strategic planning. With 3I Atlas continuing its approach toward Earth, time was running critically short for whatever preparations might prove possible. Command structures were established that bypassed traditional alliance systems and national boundaries. The threat was global, so the response would be global, regardless of political differences or historical conflicts. For the first time in human history, military leaders from NATO, Russia, China, and dozens of non-aligned nations were participating in unified command planning. Ancient enemies were sharing intelligence assets and coordinating resource allocation with efficiency that peacetime diplomacy had never achieved. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Humanity had finally achieved the military cooperation that idealists had dreamed about for centuries, but it had taken the possibility of extinction to overcome territorial disputes and ideological differences. Admiral Richardson captured the mood perfectly in his classified debriefing notes. We spent the last century preparing to fight each other while completely ignoring the possibility that something else might be preparing to fight all of us. As the meetings concluded and military leaders returned to their respective nations, each carried the same burden of impossible knowledge. They had 96 hours to absorb information that challenged everything they thought they knew about security, defense, and humanity's place in the universe. The communication blackout that had preceded the meetings was extended indefinitely. Participants were forbidden from discussing the contents with anyone lacking the highest security clearances. Even spouses and closest advisors remained unaware of why their partners seemed suddenly aged and haunted. But the real work was just beginning. Operation Silent Shield required coordinating the largest resource mobilization in human history while maintaining the appearance of routine government activities. Defense contractors found themselves receiving contracts for projects they weren't allowed to understand. Research universities discovered that their astronomy and physics departments had been classified overnight. Military installations worldwide began construction projects that required security clearances just to observe. The transformation was unprecedented in its scope and secrecy. Within weeks of the military summit, installations that had operated as routine research facilities for decades were being retrofitted with equipment that didn't appear in any public procurement records. Underground bunkers that had been mothballed since the Cold War suddenly buzzed with activity that required security clearances most government officials didn't possess. Dr. Michael Chen, a materials scientist at Los Alamos, found his laboratory transformed overnight from academic research into something resembling a wartime Manhattan Project facility. We were told to drop everything we'd been working on for the past 5 years. He would later testify in congressional hearings that remained classified for national security reasons. New equipment arrived daily, sometimes hourly. Equipment I'd never seen before, from manufacturers I'd never heard of. The funding streams were equally mysterious. Research projects that would normally require years of grant applications and budget approvals were receiving unlimited resources through channels that bypassed traditional oversight. Money was flowing so fast that procurement officers couldn't track where it was coming from or who was authorizing the expenditures. But the most disturbing aspect was the personnel changes. Scientists and engineers who had worked on civilian projects their entire careers were suddenly being reassigned to facilities they couldn't discuss with their families. Retirement plans were canceled, vacation requests were denied indefinitely. Career trajectories that had been mapped out for years vanished without explanation. Dr. Lisa Park, whose expertise in electromagnetic field manipulation had made her a respected figure in academic circles, discovered that her research had been reclassified retroactively. Papers she'd published years earlier were suddenly subject to national security restrictions. Conference presentations she'd given were being scrubbed from academic databases. The psychological impact on the scientific community was devastating. Researchers who had dedicated their lives to open inquiry and peer review found themselves working in isolation on projects they couldn't understand for purposes they weren't allowed to know. The collaborative culture that drives scientific advancement was replaced by compartmentalization and secrecy. Meanwhile, military installations worldwide were experiencing their own transformation. Bases that had served routine peacekeeping or training functions were being converted into facilities that resembled nothing in modern military architecture. Construction projects that required materials not available through standard military suppliers. Engineering specifications that pushed the boundaries of current technology. Colonel Sarah Martinez, who had overseen base construction projects throughout her career, found herself managing initiatives that defied conventional understanding. We were building facilities designed to withstand forces we couldn't measure using materials we didn't fully understand, she explained in testimony that was immediately sealed under national security provisions. The construction requirements suggested preparation for scenarios that military engineers had never been trained to consider. Hardened communication centers designed to function during electromagnetic disturbances that could disable conventional electronics. Storage facilities built to contain materials that might exhibit properties beyond current scientific knowledge. But perhaps most telling were the evacuation protocols being quietly developed at civilian installations worldwide. Hospitals, schools, government buildings, and critical infrastructure facilities were receiving updated emergency procedures that prepared for evacuation scenarios no disaster planning had ever considered. Emergency management officials found themselves developing contingency plans based on threat assessments they weren't allowed to read. Evacuation routes that assumed transportation networks might be compromised by unknown means. Supply caches positioned for scenarios that couldn't be explained to local authorities responsible for implementation. The cover stories were becoming increasingly elaborate and difficult to maintain. Space agencies worldwide were announcing asteroid defense initiatives that required funding levels normally associated with major military operations. Environmental monitoring programs were being established with surveillance capabilities that exceeded anything needed for climate research. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, whose routine astronomical observations had contributed to the initial detection of 3I Atlas, found herself at the center of what she later described as the largest scientific deception in human history. "We were telling the public we were looking for potentially hazardous asteroids," she recalled in classified congressional testimony. Technically, that was true. We just weren't mentioning that the asteroid we were most concerned about was already inside our solar system and appeared to be studying us. The media coverage of these initiatives was carefully managed through information campaigns that emphasized routine government spending rather than urgent defensive preparations. Press releases focused on long-term environmental benefits and scientific advancement rather than immediate security concerns. Journalists who attempted to investigate the sudden surge in space-related spending found their inquiries stonewalled by bureaucratic procedures that delayed information requests until the stories lost their news value. Sources who might have provided insight were reassigned to positions that prevented media contact, but the deception was becoming harder to maintain as the scale of the operation expanded beyond anything that could be explained through routine government activities. Construction projects were appearing at installations worldwide with specifications that clearly exceeded environmental monitoring or asteroid tracking requirements. Amateur astronomers and independent researchers began noticing patterns that didn't align with official explanations. Equipment installations that seemed designed for detecting objects much larger and more active than typical space debris. Personnel changes at research facilities that suggested military rather than scientific priorities. Marcus Rodriguez, whose private observatory had contributed to early tracking of unusual objects, found himself receiving visits from government officials who suggested his research might be better served through official channels. The conversations were polite, but carried implications that independent observation of certain phenomena might not be welcome. Similar pressure was being applied to amateur radio operators, independent researchers, and anyone whose activities might provide alternative sources of information about developments that governments preferred to control. The democratization of scientific observation that had characterized recent decades was being quietly reversed through a combination of financial incentives and regulatory pressure. The psychological warfare aspects of the operation were equally sophisticated. Public attention was being deliberately directed toward terrestrial concerns that seemed urgent but manageable. Economic issues, political controversies, and social problems that normally dominated news cycles were being amplified through information campaigns designed to keep public focus away from cosmic developments. Dr. Robert Kim, whose expertise in strategic communication had made him valuable for managing public perception during crisis situations, found himself coordinating what he later described as the largest information management operation in human history. "We weren't exactly lying to the public," he explained in testimony that remained classified. "We were managing their attention toward concerns they could understand and away from concerns that might cause societal collapse." The challenge was maintaining social stability while preparing for scenarios that could fundamentally alter human civilization. Public awareness of the true situation would likely cause economic disruption, social chaos, an infrastructure breakdown that would eliminate any possibility of effective defensive preparation. So the deception continued, growing more elaborate and comprehensive as the scale of preparation expanded. Research facilities that looked like environmental monitoring stations but functioned as early warning networks. Construction projects that appeared to serve civilian purposes but were designed for scenarios involving technology beyond current understanding. Military exercises that were announced as routine training but actually tested coordination protocols for managing contact scenarios. Personnel reassignments that seemed like normal career movements but actually positioned key individuals at facilities where their expertise would be most valuable during crisis situations. The international coordination required for maintaining this level of deception was staggering. Intelligence agencies that had spent decades working against each other were now collaborating to ensure that no single nation's media or research community uncovered information that could compromise the global operation. Traditional enemies were sharing disinformation strategies and coordinating cover stories with efficiency that demonstrated how quickly geopolitical differences could be set aside when facing existential threats. The cooperation was unprecedented in its scope and effectiveness, but it came at enormous psychological cost to everyone involved. General Morrison later described the moral complexity of the situation in terms that haunted her for the rest of her career. We were lying to the people we'd sworn to protect in order to protect them from information that might destroy their ability to be protected, she admitted in sealed congressional testimony. The philosophical implications were staggering. Democratic societies, based on informed public participation, were being managed through deception, justified by potential threats that the public couldn't be trusted to handle rationally. The contradictions challenged fundamental assumptions about governance, transparency, and citizen rights. But the alternatives seemed worse. Mathematical models consistently showed that public awareness of the situation would cause social and economic disruption that would eliminate any possibility of effective response to whatever contact scenarios might develop. As winter deepened and 3I Atlas continued its approach through the solar system, the secret preparations intensified. Research facilities were operating around the clock on projects that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge and capability. Military installations were being configured for scenarios that had never been considered in any strategic planning. The silence was becoming harder to maintain as the scope of activity expanded beyond anything that could be explained through routine government operations. Too many people were involved, too many resources were being mobilized, too many facilities were being transformed for the secret to remain indefinitely sustainable. Intelligence analysts were predicting that public awareness of the operation was inevitable within months, regardless of security measures. The question was whether sufficient preparation could be completed before the deception collapsed and public panic eliminated any possibility of coordinated response. Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose strategic analysis had contributed to the initial threat assessment, found herself modeling scenarios for managing public disclosure when secrecy could no longer be maintained. The timing would be critical, she explained in classified briefings. Too early, and we lose the advantage of surprise preparation. Too late, and we lose public cooperation when we need it most. The psychological preparation for eventual disclosure was almost as complex as the technological preparation for potential contact. How do you tell a civilization that everything they thought they knew about their place in the universe was wrong? How do you maintain social stability while acknowledging that humanity might be facing intelligence that viewed them as insignificant? The answers would have to be developed while continuing the largest deception in human history, preparing for contact scenarios that might never occur, and maintaining the appearance of normal government operations during the most extraordinary circumstances in recorded history. But time was running short. 3I Atlas was approaching the inner solar system, and whatever its intentions, humanity would soon discover whether months of secret preparation had been sufficient for the greatest challenge their species had ever faced. The communications blackout that followed the military summit wasn't just about maintaining operational security. It was about buying time for the most ambitious engineering project in human history. Deep beneath the Colorado mountains, construction crews were working triple shifts on facilities that officially didn't exist, building systems designed to detect and potentially communicate with technology that operated beyond human understanding. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Foster, a quantum physicist whose career had focused on theoretical research with no practical applications, suddenly found her work at the center of humanity's defensive strategy. Her equations describing quantum field manipulation, which had been purely academic for decades, were now being used to design detection systems that might actually work against 3I Atlas. The irony was staggering. Foster had spent 20 years publishing papers that her colleagues considered interesting but useless. Now, those same theoretical frameworks were being implemented in facilities that cost more than most nations' entire gross domestic products. Working 18-hour days in underground laboratories that hadn't existed 6 months earlier, Foster's team was attempting to build quantum resonance detectors that could identify artificial manipulation of space-time itself. The theory was that any technology capable of the propulsion systems demonstrated by 3I Atlas would leave detectable signatures in the quantum foam underlying reality. It was desperate science, pushing far beyond anything that had been tested or proven. But desperate times required desperate measures, and the preliminary results were encouraging enough to justify unlimited funding and resources. Meanwhile, military strategists were grappling with coordination challenges that made previous international cooperation look simple by comparison. Operation Silent Shield required real-time communication between facilities on every continent while maintaining the appearance that nothing unusual was happening. Colonel Marcus Webb, whose intelligence analysis had identified the networked nature of the surveillance operation, found himself managing communication protocols that bypassed traditional military channels entirely. Encrypted transmissions were being routed through civilian internet infrastructure to avoid detection by the very monitoring systems that governments use to watch each other. The deception was multi-layered and incredibly sophisticated. Messages about defensive preparations were disguised as routine academic correspondence between research institutions. Personnel movements were camouflaged as normal career transitions and educational exchanges. Equipment transfers appeared in procurement records as environmental monitoring and climate research supplies. But the most challenging aspect was maintaining the psychological well-being of the thousands of individuals who were now carrying the burden of impossible knowledge. Military personnel trained to handle classified information were struggling with secrets that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a military psychologist who had treated combat veterans and intelligence officers throughout his career, found himself dealing with stress reactions unlike anything in his professional experience. These aren't typical classification stress responses, he explained in reports that were immediately sealed. These are people grappling with existential uncertainty about humanity's place in the universe. The symptoms were unprecedented. Highly trained professionals were experiencing anxiety, depression, and cognitive disruption that standard military mental health protocols couldn't address. How do you treat someone whose worldview has been shattered by information they can't share with anyone outside a classified environment? Support groups were quietly established at facilities worldwide, bringing together personnel who were struggling with the psychological impact of their knowledge. The sessions were conducted under the highest security classifications, with participants forbidden from discussing even the existence of the support networks. But perhaps most disturbing were the reports from family members who noticed dramatic personality changes in their loved ones. Spouses reported that their partners seemed distant and haunted. Children noticed that their parents appeared constantly worried about something they couldn't discuss. The secrecy was creating psychological casualties throughout the extended families of everyone involved in the operation. Dr. Sarah Kim, whose materials research had been classified overnight, found herself struggling with isolation that she hadn't anticipated. The collaborative culture of scientific research had been replaced by compartmentalized secrecy that prevented her from discussing her work with anyone who might provide insight or support. You realize that your entire professional identity was built on open inquiry and peer review, she later testified in congressional hearings that remained classified. Suddenly, you're working on the most important project in human history, but you can't discuss it with anyone who might help you solve the problems you're facing. The intellectual isolation was compounded by practical challenges that seemed to multiply daily. Research teams were attempting to solve unprecedented technical problems while operating under security restrictions that prevented them from accessing the collaborative networks that normally drove scientific advancement. Academic databases that had been freely available for decades were suddenly subject to classification reviews. Conference presentations were canceled or restricted to audiences with appropriate security clearances. Professional relationships that had taken years to develop were severed overnight by compartmentalization requirements. Meanwhile, the surveillance of 3I Atlas was revealing behavioral patterns that made the situation even more urgent. The object wasn't simply passing through the solar system on a predetermined trajectory. It was actively adjusting its course to optimize observation opportunities, demonstrating real-time decision-making that confirmed intelligent control. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, whose observatory had become a critical component of the tracking network, was documenting maneuvers that violated everything she thought she knew about orbital mechanics. The object was changing velocity and direction in ways that suggested propulsion systems operating according to principles that human physics couldn't explain. More disturbing were the electromagnetic emissions that were being detected with increasing frequency and sophistication. The signals appeared to be scanning protocols, systematic sweeps of different frequency ranges that suggested comprehensive intelligence gathering about Earth's technological infrastructure. Amateur radio operators worldwide were reporting unusual interference patterns that correlated with the object's position and scanning activities. The signals were too weak and complex for definitive analysis, but their timing and characteristics suggested deliberate rather than natural phenomena. Marcus Rodriguez, whose private observatory had contributed to early detection efforts, found himself at the center of a citizen science network that was inadvertently providing intelligence about activities that governments preferred to monitor through official channels. His YouTube videos documenting unusual observations were attracting millions of views from people who sensed that something significant was happening but couldn't access official information. The democratization of astronomical observation was creating information management challenges that intelligence agencies had never faced. Traditional methods of controlling sensitive information assumed centralized sources that could be classified or restricted, but modern technology allowed thousands of independent observers to detect and share information that was impossible to suppress completely. Government officials found themselves in the unprecedented position of managing public awareness of phenomena that were too obvious to hide, but too sensitive to acknowledge. The solution was a carefully orchestrated disinformation campaign that mixed accurate technical information with misleading interpretations designed to prevent public understanding of the true implications. Social media platforms were quietly implementing algorithms that reduced the visibility of content related to unusual astronomical observations while amplifying posts about conventional space science and terrestrial concerns. The manipulation was subtle enough to appear like normal content moderation rather than deliberate censorship. Search engine results were being modified to prioritize official explanations for unusual observations while burying independent analysis that might lead to accurate conclusions about what was actually happening. The information warfare techniques developed for managing foreign propaganda were being applied to domestic information management for the first time in American history. Dr. Robert Kim, whose expertise in strategic communication made him valuable for managing public perception, found himself coordinating what amounted to a comprehensive assault on independent analysis of cosmic phenomena. We weren't preventing people from observing, he explained in classified testimony. We were preventing them from understanding what their observations meant. The ethical implications were staggering. Democratic societies were being managed through information manipulation that violated fundamental principles of free inquiry and open debate. The justification was potential social collapse if accurate information became widely available, but the cure was threatening the democratic foundations that made the society worth protecting. Intelligence analysts were modeling scenarios for maintaining the deception as public curiosity increased and independent observations became more sophisticated. The mathematical projections showed that complete information control was impossible beyond a certain threshold of public interest and amateur investigation. The timeline for inevitable exposure was shrinking rapidly as more people became involved in tracking unusual phenomena and sharing their findings through channels that governments couldn't completely control. Social media networks, amateur radio communications, and citizen science projects were creating redundant information systems that were resistant to traditional censorship methods. Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose strategic analysis had contributed to the initial threat assessment, was developing contingency plans for managing public disclosure when secrecy could no longer be maintained. The challenge was timing the revelation to maximize public cooperation while minimizing social disruption that could interfere with defensive preparations. Focus groups were being conducted under the highest security classifications to test public reactions to various disclosure scenarios. The research revealed that gradual introduction of information about unusual phenomena produced better psychological outcomes than sudden revelation of the complete situation. But gradual disclosure required time that might not be available. 3. I-Atlas was approaching the inner solar system on a timeline that didn't accommodate careful psychological preparation of the global population. Whatever contact scenarios might develop would occur whether humanity was psychologically ready or not. The pressure was building at every level of the operation. Researchers were struggling with technical challenges that pushed beyond the boundaries of human knowledge. Military personnel were planning for scenarios that exceeded their training and experience. Intelligence agencies were managing deception campaigns that violated their professional ethics while serving national security interests. Most critically, political leaders were making decisions about resource allocation and public policy based on information that they couldn't share with the constituencies they represented. Democratic governance was being replaced by technocratic management, justified by expertise that voters couldn't access or evaluate. The contradictions were becoming unsustainable as the scope of the operation expanded beyond anything that could be hidden indefinitely. Too many people were involved. Too many resources were being mobilized. Too many unusual activities were occurring simultaneously for the secret to remain secure much longer. But the alternatives remained unacceptable. Public awareness of the true situation would likely cause economic disruption, social chaos, and infrastructure breakdown that would eliminate any possibility of effective response to whatever contact scenarios might develop. The deception had to continue regardless of its psychological cost and ethical implications. As winter progressed and 3I Atlas continued its approach through the solar system, the secret preparations intensified while the challenges of maintaining secrecy multiplied. Research facilities were operating at maximum capacity on projects that pushed the boundaries of human capability while remaining invisible to public scrutiny. The silence was becoming a race against time, with completion of defensive preparations competing against the inevitable collapse of information security. Whatever humanity faced in the coming months, they would meet it with capabilities developed through the largest secret project in their history, prepared or unprepared for revelations that would change everything they thought they knew about their place in the universe. The psychological toll was becoming impossible to ignore. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had been monitoring the deep space tracking networks for 16 hours straight when she noticed something that made her question whether the stress was affecting her judgment. The electromagnetic signatures from 3I Atlas weren't just increasing in frequency and complexity, they were adapting. Each scanning sweep was slightly different from the previous one, as if the object was learning from the responses it detected. Radio telescopes worldwide were recording transmission patterns that seemed to adjust in real time based on the defensive measures that human facilities were implementing. It was like watching a chess master analyze an opponent's strategy while the game was still being played. Every countermeasure that Operation Silent Shield developed seemed to trigger corresponding adjustments in the object's behavior. The implications were terrifying beyond calculation. Colonel Sarah Martinez, who had overseen the construction of hardened communication facilities throughout the western United States, found herself staring at intercept reports that challenged everything she understood about surveillance and counter-surveillance. The object isn't just observing our preparations, she explained during a classified briefing that was attended by officials whose existence was itself classified. It's analyzing our defensive responses and modifying its approach accordingly. This level of adaptive intelligence suggested computational capabilities that exceeded human understanding by margins that couldn't be accurately calculated. Traditional concepts of operational security became meaningless when confronting technology that could apparently analyze and counter human defensive measures faster than they could be implemented. The revelation triggered immediate debates about whether to continue the current approach or fundamentally alter the entire operation. Some officials argued for complete communications blackout to prevent the object from gathering intelligence about human capabilities. Others insisted that communication coordination was essential for any defensive preparations to remain effective. Dr. Amanda Foster, whose quantum field research had become central to detection efforts, presented analysis that painted an even more disturbing picture. The object's adaptive responses suggested that it possessed detailed knowledge of human psychology and strategic thinking patterns that extended far beyond simple technological surveillance. We're not just dealing with advanced technology, Foster explained during emergency briefings that were conducted in facilities shielded against every known form of electronic surveillance. We're confronting intelligence that appears to understand how humans think, plan, and respond to threats. It's anticipating our defensive strategies before we fully develop them ourselves. The psychological warfare implications were staggering. If 3I Atlas could predict human responses with sufficient accuracy to counter them preemptively, then traditional concepts of strategic surprise and tactical advantage became completely obsolete. Humanity was playing a game where their opponent could see their moves before they made them. Intelligence agencies worldwide began implementing what they called cognitive security protocols, attempting to compartmentalize strategic planning to prevent the object from gathering intelligence about human decision-making processes through electronic surveillance. But the measures felt desperately inadequate against technology that appeared to operate according to principles that human security doctrine had never contemplated. Meanwhile, the cover stories that had been carefully constructed to explain the massive resource mobilization were beginning to strain under the weight of activities that couldn't be explained through environmental monitoring or routine scientific research. Construction projects were appearing at facilities worldwide, with specifications that clearly exceeded anything needed for climate studies or asteroid tracking. Dr. Michael Chen, whose materials laboratory had been transformed overnight from academic research into something resembling a wartime weapons development facility, found himself managing projects that required security clearances just to observe the equipment being installed. We're building systems designed to detect and potentially interfere with technology that operates according to physical principles we don't understand, he testified in congressional hearings that were immediately classified at levels that prevented most government officials from accessing them. The technological challenges were pushing human engineering capabilities beyond their theoretical limits. Research teams were attempting to develop countermeasures against propulsion systems that appeared to manipulate gravitational fields, communication methods that might operate through quantum entanglement, and materials that exhibited properties that violated conventional understanding of chemistry and physics. But perhaps most disturbing were the energy readings that were being detected as 3. Atlas continued its approach through the solar system. The object was demonstrating power output that suggested access to energy sources that human science could barely describe theoretically, much less harness practically. Dr. Lisa Park, whose expertise in electromagnetic field manipulation had made her valuable for analyzing the object's capabilities, published classified reports that read more like science fiction than technical analysis. Though energy densities we're measuring exceed anything that should be possible using conventional matter, antimatter reactions, she wrote in documents that were distributed only to individuals with the highest security clearances. The object appears to be accessing energy sources that operate outside our current understanding of thermodynamics and conservation laws. If these readings are accurate, we're observing technology that can manipulate the fundamental forces of nature in ways that approach godlike capabilities. The religious implications weren't lost on anyone involved in the analysis. Military chaplains found themselves counseling personnel who were struggling with the theological challenges of encountering technology that seemed to transcend natural law. How do you maintain faith in divine authority when confronting intelligence that can apparently violate the physical laws that govern creation? Vatican representatives who had been quietly briefed on the situation issued carefully worded statements about divine mystery encompassing possibilities beyond human understanding, while emphasizing that spiritual authority transcended any technological capabilities. But the theological discussions were taking place at security levels that prevented most religious leaders from participating in the conversations. Similar challenges were emerging in scientific communities worldwide. Researchers whose careers had been built on understanding natural law found themselves confronting phenomena that challenged the foundations of physical science. Peer review processes that relied on reproducible results became meaningless when dealing with technology that operated according to principles that human science hadn't discovered. Dr. Robert Kim, whose strategic analysis had contributed to early threat assessments, found himself modeling scenarios that pushed beyond every framework that political science and military strategy had developed for managing international crises. We're dealing with intelligence that may operate on timelines measured in millennia while possessing capabilities that make human technology look primitive. He explained in briefings that were attended by officials who lacked the conceptual frameworks necessary for understanding the implications. Traditional concepts of deterrence, negotiation, and conflict resolution become irrelevant when confronting such vast differences in capability and perspective. We may be facing intelligence that views humanity the way we view bacteria colonies, with all the strategic implications that comparison suggests. The comparison triggered immediate debates about communication strategies and first contact protocols. If 3I Atlas represented intelligence that viewed humans as insignificant, then attempts at diplomatic communication might be as meaningless as bacteria attempting to negotiate with microbiologists. But if the intelligence was capable of recognizing human consciousness and moral worth, then communication might be possible despite technological disparities. Communication specialists from multiple nations were developing protocols for attempting contact with intelligence that operated according to completely unknown principles. The challenge was enormous when dealing with minds that might think in ways that human psychology couldn't access or understand. Dr. Maria Santos, whose expertise in linguistics and communication theory had made her valuable for developing contact protocols, published classified analysis that highlighted the fundamental challenges of interspecies communication with intelligence that had evolved under completely different conditions. We're attempting to communicate with minds that may operate according to logical frameworks that we cannot access, she wrote in reports that were distributed only to facilities directly involved in contact preparation. Our concepts of language, meaning, and consciousness may be completely inadequate for understanding how such intelligence processes information and makes decisions. The linguistic challenges were compounded by uncertainty about whether 3I Atlas represented individual intelligence or some form of collective consciousness that operated according to principles that human psychology had never encountered. The adaptive behavior patterns suggested decision-making processes that were either incredibly sophisticated individual intelligence or coordinated group intelligence that functioned as a unified entity. Amateur astronomers and independent researchers were beginning to notice patterns that suggested the object's behavior was more complex than official explanations could account for. Online communities dedicated to tracking unusual astronomical phenomena were sharing observations that correlated in ways that indicated systematic rather than random activities. Marcus Rodriguez, whose Arizona Observatory had become a focal point for citizen science efforts, found himself documenting behavioral patterns that professional institutions were reluctant to acknowledge publicly. The object's trajectory modifications, electromagnetic emissions, and apparent scanning activities were being recorded by hundreds of independent observers who were sharing their findings through channels that governments couldn't completely control. The democratization of astronomical observation was creating information management challenges that traditional security protocols had never been designed to handle. Suppressing information from centralized sources was relatively straightforward, but preventing thousands of independent observers from sharing their findings required information warfare techniques that threatened the open communication systems that democratic societies depended upon. Social media platforms were implementing increasingly sophisticated algorithms designed to reduce the visibility of content related to unusual astronomical observations while amplifying posts about conventional space science and terrestrial concerns. The manipulation was becoming obvious enough that technology-savvy users were beginning to recognize and circumvent the content restrictions. Search engine results were being modified so extensively that researchers were beginning to notice the discrepancies between what they expected to find and what the algorithms were providing. Independent analysis of cosmic phenomena was being systematically buried, while official explanations were being promoted regardless of their accuracy or completeness. The information manipulation was creating a parallel information ecosystem where official sources provided carefully managed narratives, while independent researchers were sharing uncensored observations through encrypted channels and alternative platforms. The division was undermining public trust in institutional authority while making accurate information harder for ordinary citizens to access. Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose strategic analysis had contributed to the initial threat assessment, found herself modeling scenarios for managing public disclosure when information control could no longer be maintained. Mathematical projections showed that complete suppression of independent analysis was impossible beyond certain thresholds of public interest and technological capability. The timeline for inevitable exposure was accelerating as more sophisticated observation equipment became available to amateur researchers, and citizen science networks became more effective at coordinating their findings. Government agencies were racing against time to complete defensive preparations before public awareness of the situation eliminated their ability to operate in secrecy. Focus groups conducted under the highest security classifications were revealing that public reactions to potential disclosure varied dramatically based on how the information was presented and what context was provided for understanding the implications. Gradual introduction of unusual phenomena produced better psychological outcomes than sudden revelation of existential threats. But gradual disclosure required cooperation from media organizations and educational institutions that were increasingly skeptical of official explanations for phenomena that independent observers were documenting with growing sophistication. The credibility gap was widening as the scope of unusual activities became harder to explain through conventional narratives. Military installations worldwide were experiencing construction and personnel changes that exceeded anything that could be attributed to routine modernization or environmental monitoring initiatives. Defense contractors were receiving contracts for projects that required security clearances just to understand what they were being asked to build. The industrial mobilization was beginning to affect economic indicators in ways that financial analysts were struggling to explain through conventional models. Government spending was increasing dramatically in sectors related to advanced materials, research, electromagnetic systems, and exotic propulsion technologies, while being disguised as environmental and climate monitoring initiatives. Stock markets were experiencing volatility that reflected underlying uncertainty about developments that investors could sense but couldn't accurately identify or analyze. Technology companies involved in advanced research were seeing dramatic fluctuations in their valuations based on speculation about government contracts that couldn't be confirmed through traditional financial reporting. The economic implications were becoming as significant as the technological challenges. Preparing for potential contact with advanced intelligence required resource allocation that pushed beyond anything that peacetime economies had ever supported, while maintaining the appearance that nothing extraordinary was occurring. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, whose space telescope operations had become critical components of the tracking network, found herself coordinating observation campaigns that involved more resources and personnel than some nations' entire space programs, while operating under cover stories that couldn't account for the true scope of the activities. We're conducting the most intensive surveillance operation in human history while pretending that we're engaged in routine scientific research, she explained in testimony that was immediately classified at levels that prevented congressional oversight committees from accessing the information. The contradiction is becoming impossible to maintain as the scale of our activities exceeds anything that our official explanations can support. The surveillance capabilities being deployed against 3I Atlas represented integration of military and scientific resources that had never been attempted during peacetime conditions. Deep space monitoring networks that had been designed for asteroid tracking were being enhanced with detection capabilities that approached the theoretical limits of human technology. But even these enhanced systems were providing information that challenged human understanding of what constituted possible behavior for objects operating in space. The trajectory modifications, energy emissions, and apparent communication activities demonstrated capabilities that exceeded human engineering by margins that couldn't be accurately calculated. As winter deepened and 3I Atlas continued its approach toward the inner solar system, the secret preparations were approaching completion, while the challenges of maintaining secrecy were becoming insurmountable. The largest deception in human history was racing against time to achieve objectives that might prove inadequate for challenges that exceeded every model of contact or conflict that human civilization had ever contemplated. The silence that had begun with the largest military meeting in history was about to be broken by revelations that would force humanity to confront their place in a universe that was far stranger and more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. Whatever happened next, the world that emerged would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before 3I Atlas appeared in Earth's skies. The breaking point came exactly 127 days after the first detection, when Dr. Jennifer Walsh received a transmission that changed everything. At 3:47 a.m. Mountain Time, her deep space monitoring array detected something that made her hands shake as she reached for the secure phone that connected directly to NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain facility. The signal wasn't coming from 3I Atlas. It was coming from Earth. More specifically, it was coming from a location in the Nevada desert that officially didn't exist, broadcasting on frequencies that weren't supposed to be accessible to civilian equipment. But Walsh's heavily modified detection systems, enhanced with quantum field resonators that had cost more than most universities' annual budgets, were picking up structured transmissions that could only be described as a response protocol. someone was talking back to 3 and they were doing it without authorization from any of the 47 nations that had participated in Operation Silent Shield. Within minutes, encrypted communications were flooding through the secret networks that connected military installations across 6 continents. The message was simple but terrifying. The unified command structure that had been so carefully constructed was fracturing under pressures that no strategic planning had anticipated. Colonel Marcus Webb, whose intelligence analysis had identified the distributed nature of the alien surveillance network, found himself coordinating the most urgent threat assessment since the operation began. We have confirmation of unauthorized communication attempts with the target object, he reported during emergency briefings that were conducted in facilities shielded against every known form of electronic surveillance. The transmissions appear to be originating from a faction within our own intelligence community that has decided to pursue independent contact protocols without coordination with international partners. The implications were staggering beyond comprehension. After months of unprecedented global cooperation, the unified response to humanity's first contact with alien intelligence was disintegrating due to the same territorial instincts and competitive pressures that had driven human conflict throughout recorded history. Dr. Amanda Foster, whose quantum field research had become central to detection efforts, was analyzing the unauthorized transmissions with equipment that pushed the boundaries of human technology. The signals were sophisticated beyond anything that conventional human communication systems should have been capable of generating, suggesting access to research and development programs that operated outside the acknowledged structure of Operation Silent Shield. We're looking at communication protocols that utilize quantum entanglement principles in ways that our official research hasn't achieved, she explained during classified briefings that were attended by officials who were discovering that their security clearances didn't provide access to all the programs operating under their authority. Someone has been conducting parallel research that exceeds our acknowledged capabilities by significant margins. This suggests compartmentalized programs that were initiated before the official international cooperation began. The revelation triggered immediate investigations into the command structure that had seemed so carefully coordinated during the initial crisis response. Intelligence agencies that had been sharing information and resources with unprecedented transparency suddenly discovered that their cooperation had been incomplete from the beginning. Each major power had apparently maintained secret research programs that continued operating outside the unified command structure, developing capabilities and pursuing objectives that hadn't been shared with international partners. The global cooperation that had seemed like humanity's greatest achievement was revealed to be a carefully constructed illusion that concealed continued competition and mistrust. Russian intelligence analysts were reporting similar unauthorized activities originating from facilities in Siberia that weren't included in any of the resource allocation agreements that had been negotiated during the Switzerland summit. Chinese monitoring stations were detecting transmission attempts from locations in the Gobi Desert that appeared to be using technology that exceeded anything that had been acknowledged in international cooperation protocols. European intelligence services were discovering that their own military installations had been conducting research programs that operated under classification levels so high that even senior officials involved in Operation Silent Shield hadn't been briefed on their existence. The compartmentalization that had been designed to protect the secret from public exposure had also concealed the fact that the secret itself was fragmented among competing national interests. General Patricia Morrison, whose leadership of U.S. Space Command had been central to the international coordination efforts, found herself managing a crisis that threatened to destroy the unified response just as it was approaching its most critical phase. We've discovered that our allies have been pursuing independent contact strategies while maintaining the appearance of full cooperation. She reported in communications that were encrypted using protocols that hadn't been shared with the international partners who were supposed to be receiving complete intelligence sharing. The competitive pressures that we thought we had overcome through mutual recognition of existential threats have actually been operating throughout the entire operation. Every major participant has been hedging their bets by maintaining secret programs that could provide national advantages if contact scenarios develop in ways that favor unilateral rather than multilateral approaches. The psychological impact on personnel who had sacrificed personal relationships and professional ethics to support what they believed was humanity's unified response was devastating beyond measure. Military officers who had violated their national oaths to participate in international cooperation were discovering that their sacrifices had been exploited by their own governments to gain advantages over the allies they thought they were serving. Dr. Sarah Kim, whose materials research had been classified and compartmentalized to support the international effort, learned that her work had been simultaneously shared with unauthorized programs that were pursuing competitive rather than cooperative objectives. The intellectual property that she had developed under the assumption that it would serve humanity's collective defense was being used to create advantages for specific nations in potential contact scenarios. You realize that your entire understanding of what you were contributing to was based on deceptions that your own government was maintaining, even while demanding your complete honesty and transparency. She testified in congressional hearings that were immediately classified at levels that prevented oversight committees from accessing the information. The moral complexity of the situation was becoming impossible for personnel to process psychologically. They had been asked to violate democratic principles and personal ethics to support what they believed was humanity's collective survival, only to discover that their sacrifices were being exploited for competitive advantages by the same authorities who had demanded their loyalty. Meanwhile, the unauthorized communication attempts were triggering responses from 3I Atlas that suggested the object was capable of distinguishing between different sources of human contact attempts and was analyzing the competitive rather than cooperative nature of the transmissions. The electromagnetic signatures being detected by monitoring stations worldwide indicated that the object was adjusting its behavior based on recognition that humanity was internally divided rather than unified in its approach to contact. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, whose detection arrays were recording the real-time responses to unauthorized communication attempts, found herself documenting behavioral changes that confirmed the worst fears of strategic analysts who had warned about the importance of presenting unified rather than fragmented responses to advanced intelligence. The object appears to be conducting separate analysis of each contact attempt rather than treating them as communications from a single unified entity. She reported in briefings that were conducted under security protocols that prevented most government officials from understanding the full implications of the intelligence being gathered. This suggests that it recognizes humanity as a collection of competing factions rather than a coherent civilization, which fundamentally alters the strategic context for any contact scenarios that might develop. The implications for humanity's position in potential negotiations or conflicts were catastrophic. Advanced intelligence that could analyze and exploit human competitive instincts would possess enormous advantages in any contact scenario, regardless of whether the encounter developed along peaceful or hostile lines. Military strategists found themselves modeling scenarios where human divisions could be manipulated by intelligence that possessed detailed knowledge of terrestrial political structures, economic systems, and social psychology. The possibility that 3I Atlas could play human factions against each other created vulnerabilities that no defensive preparation had anticipated. Colonel Sarah Martinez, whose construction oversight had created hardened communication facilities throughout multiple continents, discovered that her carefully designed systems were being compromised by the very governments that had commissioned their construction. Security protocols that had been developed to prevent alien intelligence gathering were being bypassed by human intelligence agencies that were pursuing competitive advantages over their supposed allies. We built these systems to protect humanity's communications from external surveillance, she explained in testimony that was classified immediately after completion. We never anticipated that the greatest threat to operational security would come from our own partners who were using access to our defensive systems to conduct unauthorized operations that compromise everyone's security. The revelation that the unified command structure had been compromised from its inception triggered immediate debates about whether to continue the cooperative approach or acknowledge that competitive national interests had made unified response impossible. Some officials argued for complete transparency about the situation to restore trust and coordination. Others insisted that revealing the extent of the fragmentation would eliminate any possibility of effective response to whatever contact scenarios might develop. Dr. Robert Kim, whose strategic analysis had contributed to the initial threat assessment, found himself modeling scenarios for managing contact when human unity was revealed to be an illusion rather than a reality. His calculations painted disturbing pictures of how advanced intelligence might exploit human divisions to achieve objectives that would be impossible against unified opposition. An intelligence capable of analyzing our competitive instincts and political divisions possesses strategic advantages that could make military resistance irrelevant, he wrote in classified reports that were distributed only to officials with the highest security clearances. Contact scenarios that assume human unity become meaningless when the contact is occurring with a species that is internally divided and competitive rather than cooperative. The competitive pressures that had been temporarily suppressed by recognition of existential threats were reasserting themselves with interest as different factions positioned themselves for potential advantages in contact scenarios that might provide access to technology that could revolutionize military capabilities, economic systems, or scientific understanding. Intelligence agencies that had been sharing information were beginning to withhold critical data that might provide competitive advantages to rival nations. Research facilities that had been coordinating their efforts were discovering that their supposed partners had been conducting parallel programs designed to achieve breakthrough results that wouldn't be shared through international cooperation channels. The psychological warfare implications were becoming as significant as the technological challenges. Personnel who had been recruited to support humanity's unified response were discovering that they had been manipulated by their own governments to participate in competitive rather than cooperative efforts. Mental health professionals who had been treating personnel struggling with the stress of carrying impossible secrets found themselves dealing with additional trauma caused by revelations that the moral framework justifying their sacrifices had been based on deceptions maintained by their own command structures. Dr. Maria Santos, whose linguistics expertise had contributed to communication protocol development, learned that her work had been shared with unauthorized programs that were pursuing independent contact strategies designed to provide national advantages rather than serve humanity's collective interests. The protocols she had developed under the assumption that they would facilitate peaceful contact were being adapted for competitive purposes that could destabilize any contact scenario. You spend months developing communication frameworks based on the assumption that you're serving humanity's collective interests, she explained in testimony that was immediately classified. Then you discover that your work is being used to create competitive advantages that could turn